Welcome to the Justice Outside the Box podcast. Today we're talking about the role of counseling in family law. Our guest today is Jamie Smith, and Jamie Smith is a family law lawyer for 8 years, has a master's in counseling, so he's able to connect both of those together. Welcome, Jamie.
Hey, thanks, man.
So I think the first question that people ask when they look at counseling anywhere is, why do I need counseling?
I think counseling is critically important in a lot of different scenarios for people's lives. It's hard for people to go through life and not have an outlet to express how they're feeling about things or express it in a healthy way. It's one of our biggest, I think, failings sometimes is our desire to either keep things bottled up or alternatively to maybe share the things that we're feeling to people who maybe aren't going to be a healthy person to be receiving that information. So oftentimes we're going to want to spill things onto our partner, our spouse, our children, our parents, our coworkers, and sometimes that's not the best place to be funneling a lot of those big emotions. And so, for example, in family law, sometimes counseling therapy is just a really good avenue for individuals to take because it's healthier and sometimes more cost effective than funneling it maybe towards your lawyer or to your former partner.
So as a lawyer, I sometimes think that I'm a counselor when I deal with family law matters as well, because some of the emotions and trying to figure out solutions to problems, you have to build rapport with clients in order to, establish a degree of trust. But in doing so, they come to me and they talk about all these other things that there really isn't a legal solution to. Minor disputes regarding things like they didn't return a particular item that isn't of any consequential value or necessity, but it's just bothering them. Similarly, and I can totally relate to what you're saying about children. I see it a lot where parents can treat their children, especially with absence of no one else around, as in they don't have any family in their local area, and they treat their children almost like emotional support animals. And so there's, the child who's already dealing with the trauma of their parents separating is then getting either one or both parents, the dump of all the problems and emotions onto them. And so then that makes them seem to have to be more of like a protective role or more of an adult than what they really are.
Absolutely. I mean, you can even look at adult relationships where sort of you have the relationship where a child and their parents sort of have that relationship of best friend. And, if you're the child and you've grown up and, your mom or your dad is essentially your best friend and you're their best friend, but then the relationship breaks down, well, oftentimes you're the recipient of a lot of those feelings that your parent might be expressing, but might not be making you feel really good as the child in those situations because even if you're an adult, nobody really likes to hear somebody talk badly about the other parent. And so coming at from the approach of the parent, you have to be very cognizant of like, who am I putting the weight of these feelings and emotions onto? Should I be putting those things onto, my kid when the person that I have a beef with is their other parent? I mean, are we impacting the way that they feel about that other parent? And it doesn't really matter whether that other parent is, or whether the child is a minor or whether they're an adult themselves. An adult might have the ability to make their own decisions about a set of circumstances, but do you really want to be damaging that relationship? Is it the best thing to be damaging that relationship because you have some negative feelings about this other person?
So kind of like putting your counseling hat on, say you're a parent and you realize that you are doing this. What do you suggest?
Stop right there. Don't stop putting things onto your kids. That's number one. We don't want to be negatively impacting anybody in our life if we can help it, with the things that we're feeling. But the best thing to do is to maybe go and find somebody who's going to have at least neutral feelings about the person that you're talking about in therapy. This is when it's a really good time to seek out some counseling, and it could be a one-off. It could be continuous. Maybe it's group therapy. There's a bunch of different alternatives available for individuals who are going through a family law dispute, a divorce, a separation, any of these things, and it's going to stop the process of, or maybe reduce the process of transferring all of these negative feelings and this negative energy onto the people who are in your environment.
So I know when I look at counseling, I deal with clients. Sometimes there's this resistance to counseling for children. And I'll get parents who say, well, the child doesn't need to go to counseling. There's nothing wrong. They're able to cope with their things. They're young. They'll get over it. They put these kind of like negative obstacles in the way of doing it. What do you think are the best benefits of a child attending counseling when their parents are going through a separation?
So one of my biggest experiences with kids specifically is that kids try to be people pleasers. They want to please their parents, whether that's mom and dad or another guardian. So they're trying their hardest to attract the love and attention and affection of the parents that are going through a separation, maybe. Well, if you are trying to please two parents who have issues with each other, sometimes these kids are going to be experiencing feelings of am I breaching one parent's trust if I'm doing something for this one parent versus the other parent? Having kids go into therapy gives them a safe space to express feelings. They can express feelings like, I don't really like it when mom does this. I don't really like it when dad does that. I'd really like to spend more time at mom's place, or I'd love to spend more time at dad's place. Even feelings that maybe don't have a realistic outcome. I'd really love it if mom and dad could get back together again. Those are feelings that, if they're expressed in a safe place, a therapist can kind of help to expand on those feelings a little bit, but also, given the right opportunities, it might be an opportunity for that therapist to act as a third party in the room to help the child express those feelings to a parent in a safe way, because they have the therapist whom hopefully they'll learn to trust well enough to know that if they are able to be in the room at the same time as one of the parents, or maybe both parents, with the therapist, they're going to be able to say things that maybe otherwise they wouldn't have felt safe to say.
And when I look at, again, I think of Progressive, again, being a lawyer, doing a lot of family law over 9 years, and I think of different age groups for children. And when you say, people pleasers, I find that goes, the younger they are, the more they're doing that, and from trying to just maintain like a protective environment for themselves. Like, I'm trying to cocoon myself and make myself as safe as possible, so I know there's conflict between, Mama Bear and Papa Bear, so as the cub, I am just going to do whatever I can to not get hurt. And then as they get older and more independent and they get, 13, 14, 15, I also find sometimes it's the opposite, where you get like this, well, mom said I could do this, and they go to the dad who's over here and says, you know what, dad said that I could buy the, Nintendo Switch, and they tell, well, mom said I could buy, even because they know that the parents aren't able to communicate. And so, like, I still think even for those individuals, having them go to counseling, or even having the parents go to counseling when they have children and they recognize those behaviors they're doing, is how do they address that? How do they address communication with the other parent? Which tends to be one of the largest things I see from counseling for parents going through, is how do I deal with this conflict that I'm having while we're both still trying to raise these children that we had together for however many years.
Yeah. So, yeah, the whole idea of having kids play separate parents off one another. It's nothing new. I mean, kids play parents off of each other when the parents aren't separated, right? I can remember going to mom and asking for something, and then you wander over to dad, and dad was always the one who was just a little bit more relaxed, and dad, can I do this? Best case scenario for my dad in those situations was, did you ask your mom first? Yeah, and what did mom say? She said I couldn't. Well, why are you asking me then? I mean, that's the best form of co-parenting is the one where you're doing your checks and balances. Are both parents on the same side here? No? Okay, let's try to reconcile that. Is there a reason that one parent is doing something? Now, move that into the separated parent scenario, and yeah, mom and dad are going to get played off of one another. It's a question of these issues. What do we feel strongly about? What are the things that we absolutely feel our children need for boundaries? And what are some things that they can be flexible on? When we're dealing with maybe really young kids, maybe we're talking about bedtime. And so maybe bedtime is actually critically important to be talking about as, separated parents, because if bedtime is 8 o'clock, because we know if they go to bed later than 8, when they wake up for school the next morning, they're going to be, little monsters. We want everybody on the same page in terms of why 8 o'clock is the appropriate bedtime. But maybe as we get older, the bedtime isn't the really critical thing. But maybe the most important thing is, okay, what are our curfews in terms of going out with friends? When do we expect you to be back in the house? What is our overall thought on drinking and on drug use? Because, surprise, we might be family law lawyers, we might say, no, that's a bad thing. It's happening anyway. So what are our feelings on these things when our kids eventually are going to encounter them? Good co-parenting says that parents have a common set of rules for these big items, and then there's flexible pieces in between. I'm sure as a family law lawyer, you're going to agree with me on this. It's that we so often see that parents try to micromanage parts of parenting that maybe don't need to be micromanaged, and it causes so much conflict and costs parties so many thousands of dollars in trying to sort out small conflicts, when maybe it's the bigger things that really need to be addressed, and the little things can just be left to the other parent to sort out.
And it's funny you mentioned co-parenting. So I find co-parenting is effective when parties can communicate, and they can say, this is what I'm thinking, or hey, little Johnny told us that this was going on. I want to check in with you to make sure that that's actually what happened. The problem is when parents can't communicate, and you go into a role of, or there's a massive trust barrier, and they're not communicating with each other, or they have such different personalities that co-parenting isn't possible. And so when that happens, the terminology I tend to hear is called parallel parenting.
Yeah.
And so going back to counseling, when I think of that too, is if you're in a situation, and I think with my clients, and I tell them, where communication is so broken down that it's just not possible, you still need to, parent these children. Sometimes counseling can help with a parallel parenting, so that you're not triggered as much by things that the other person does or says, that you're able to set aside some of those smaller things and not need to micromanage them as well. So although it can, I think that it can help you in creating communication, sometimes it's about helping you not communicating, what can you do when you're not communicating.
Yeah. And that's exactly it. People don't fully appreciate the value in silence. People don't necessarily appreciate the value in a little bit of delay and a little bit of waiting, a little bit of time for reflection. If you are going through something like that, where there's that communication breakdown, going and seeing a therapist, seeing a counselor, and talking about those kinds of things can be incredibly helpful. It gives one of the major things that a therapist can help with is with emotional regulation. So if you are finding yourself set off constantly by the way that another person says something, or the way that they treat you, or the way that they communicate, whether it's maybe passively or aggressively, or worse, passive aggressively. In therapy, you have the ability to work on some of those emotional regulation skills, which at the end of the day can be incredibly helpful in reducing the amount of conflict between parties.
So even beyond counseling, a lot of my clients will want something called an intervention or an assessment. And when you look at those different intervention assessments, typically they're court ordered and they fall under something either a practice note 7 or a practice note 8. And practice notes are just rules and guidelines set out by the court, not legislation or anything like that the government would do. And they just provide a guideline of how this is going to do. But where a lot of my clients don't understand is that they think of practice note 7s or practice notes 8s, these assessments or interventions, there's just one kind of them, right? And there's like the less intensive practice note 7 or the more intensive practice note 8. Um, would you, as a counselor, recommend those types of interventions?
So I think one of the most important pieces to really recognize about either of those types of interventions is what is the purpose that you're using them for in the first place, uh, because those interventions tend to be more expensive than regular therapy and regular counseling. So, for example, if you need some help in co-parenting or communicating with the other parent, is this something that you can do without the assistance of the court? And the answer is yes. You can go to a therapist. You can go to a counselor's office and say, "We need help with this." And if the two of you can agree to it, it's probably going to be cheaper than getting the court ordered version. The other piece of this, though, is what is the scope that you're looking for? Because oftentimes when we go to court and we say we need a practice note 7, which is traditionally used as a voice of the child, we want to know what the kid is thinking about on maybe this particular topic. If you don't give good direction to the therapist or the counselor who's working on these things, it's very difficult to get a good report and good information back, because at the end of the day, that therapist is sort of working there primarily to support, maybe in this case, the child, getting their opinions and thoughts on things and trying to assess how they're doing. But in the report back, if the therapist doesn't have good instruction in the first place, your report's not going to maybe address all the issues that you need. So I guess I definitely recommend having these types of interventions, but knowing why you're going for the interventions in the first place and being really specific in the parameters that you're putting onto the therapist are probably a good thing. But also, working with the therapist before you get the order to know what it is that the therapist might want for some guidelines first might also be a good thing.
So the paradox that I run into is that most people want a practice note 7 to get the voice of the child, to find out where the child wants to stay or how much time the child wants to spend with each parent. Yet the practice note 7 explicitly states that therapists are not supposed to be giving opinions in practice note 7s on where the child should stay.
Yes.
And so, in trying to help parents come up with a tool to just kind of provide a third party independent check in about what the child actually wants, realizing that, as we've talked about, the child is, in people pleasing mode and can tell both parents the opposite to match up with what they think the parent wants to hear from them. What other tools have you dealt with, either from a counseling role or a legal role, to kind of fill that gap of we want to find out what this child wants?
Sure. So, family therapy involving maybe both parents and the child might be a good step, because you're going to have everybody in one room, hopefully with a therapist that the child can learn to trust and be able to express some opinion. That's one option. Another option is having counsel appointed for the child. So not a counselor, but another lawyer appointed for the child who can take into account the best interests of the child, for example, and can express the opinions that they receive from that child to the court. And so the role of the therapist is important, but as you said, the Practice Note 7 is pretty express in terms of, should not be providing an opinion as to where the child should be, living, for example. But those same limitations don't exist with respect to a lawyer acting in the best interest of a child.
The other issue that I run to with Practice Note 7 is obviously cost. And so
Yes.
one of the more newer requirements for any assessment or intervention is prior to asking the court for it, you have to be able to afford it.
Yeah.
And I'm finding that the Practice Note 7 costs are increasing. And maybe like 6, 7 years ago, it was $2,500 to $4,000 to get a Practice Note 7. I'm finding now it's like $4,000 to $8,000 to get a Practice Note 7. And there's a massive amount of, and there's a lack of individuals who actually provide these types of assessments, even in larger towns. So outside of like major cities, if you live in a larger town, there might not be a psychologist that does the assessments themselves, which means you're also driving to taking the whole day off of work, not just jumping out at lunch, grabbing your kid, going there or something like that, or making it go after work because you have to drive into a larger center.
It's it's turned into a bit of an economy thing. It's a supply and demand. There aren't enough individuals who are qualified for doing the Practice Note 7 assessment. They are very costly. Uh, One of the benefits is to going through therapy and going through counseling outside the scope of what the courts require is that you have the possibility of maybe achieving the same results at a fraction of the price. Part of the reason that Practice Note 7s are so expensive is you're not just paying for the hourly session rate for these professionals, but you're also paying for the report that they're going to have to provide at the end. And also, to be perfectly honest, it's a little bit of insurance that if you have to get called to provide evidence at court at some point in time, you're going to be able to recoup some of your costs because, a professional that gets subpoenaed to be away at a trial, for example, probably isn't going to be making the same amount at that trial as they'd be making if they had a full day of clients. So it really is supply and demand, and if you can get the result that you're hoping for by scheduling an appointment with a family therapist, you might save a lot of money.
So, like, even when we talk about like making appointments, especially during COVID, we've seen a greater transition from counseling services being offered remotely. When more and more people saying, "Look, I can be a counselor and I'm in Connecticut in the United States, but I can still offer that service to someone in Los Angeles or in Canada or wherever in the world, because the theory behind it would still be the same." Do you think that remote services is something that's functional for people in, again, like a separation, and either for adults and for kids?
So, in my experience, I've always found that in-person therapy appointments tend to be a little bit more effective. One of the biggest catalysts for change in any therapy is the quality of the relationship between the therapist and the client. And it's way easier to build a strong relationship when you're sitting in a room together, sharing, those sort of moments and feelings and things like that. A lot more difficult when you're two faces on a screen, right? That's not to say that it's not valuable, though. And so, especially when you're dealing with adults, older, older kids and things like that, remote sessions are probably going to be about as good. You might take a little bit longer to develop that sort of strong therapeutic relationship, but you're still going to be able to get there. Kids are a little bit different. It's a lot harder to pay attention to somebody on a screen who's asking you really personal questions for a period of time. It's a lot harder to do things like play therapy, for example, where maybe we're trying to figure out the emotions of a child through the way that they're playing or the way that they're expressing themselves, and maybe the things that they're drawing. So it's a lot harder for younger kids to get the same quality of experience out of remote therapy. It's not to say it can't be done, but in my opinion, in person is usually best.
The I think that's again what we're saying when you mentioned play therapy. Um, and again, that's a word that a lot of my clients will come across and say we offer play therapy as a counseling tool
Yeah.
for children. Um, when do you think play therapy would be effective, and when do you think it would not be effective?
I'm not an expert on play therapy. Is I tend to focus on more mature kids and adults and things like that. But play therapy is a really effective tool when you're dealing with kids that maybe don't have the language or the capacity to be expressing their emotions with words. It's very easy to for kids to express emotions in other ways. So sometimes it's through drawing a particular scenario. Sometimes it's about how they interact with certain toys or interact with the therapist as somebody who's in that environment. So it's best used for children trying to express maybe emotions or feelings that they just don't have the language for at this stage.
You're not be able to verbalize.
Exactly. I'm not saying that they're nonverbal
Mhm.
because we get a different problem at that stage. But if I know my emotions are happy, sad, and angry, maybe I don't understand jealousy or confusion or deep sorrow. There's a lot of different types of emotions that a person could be experiencing without being able to actually label it. And oftentimes, being able to label your emotion is one of the most important and one of the most powerful things a person can do.
I feel this when you do this.
I feel this when you do this, or I'm feeling this way right now, and I know when I feel this way, I can do this other thing to make me feel better or to change that emotion. Like I said earlier, emotional regulation is one of the core things that a therapist can help with because as soon as we learn how to regulate our emotions, and especially extreme emotions, it helps us solve a lot of our problems.
I'm just I find it's funny again. Family law lawyer, people dealing with trauma. I find these two extremes where I'd say, and I recommend to people you should probably talk to counseling. And one is just that they're so emotional, they need to be able to kind of manage that in a better way. And the opposite is this: they're just not expressing anything, and that's in my opinion, something worth pursuing as well. Just be able to say, you know, I love you. You make me angry when this happens. I'm sad when this happens, and being able to just figure out how to express those things instead of just consuming them, internalizing them.
Definitely. So, as a lawyer, one of the things I often do in usually it's my first appointment with clients. Clients will usually start expressing emotions to you in their first appointment with a lawyer where they're really getting into things. And, it might be expressions of anger or sadness or fear. I mean, the list goes on and on in terms of what a person might be experiencing. But normally, I will end the conversation or wrap up our conversation with, "Are you are you taking the time to talk to anybody about these things?" I usually don't like leading with the word, "Are you going to therapy? Are you going to counseling?" Because there's still that stigma in mental health where somebody who has a therapist must be mentally unwell. And so I try to approach from the perspective of, are you taking the time to talk to somebody about these things? People are usually pretty quick to pick up on, oh yeah, I'm going to see a therapist, or I've thought about seeing a counselor, but I'm just not really sure if I can or if I can afford it. And those kinds of questions do come up. And it's at that point in time I'll usually give them some referrals to local resources for who they can go and see or numbers they can call to try to make those connections. I think it's really doing your client a big service to offer them that as one of the solutions for their problem, because when we deal with people who are in family law crises, separations, divorces, explosive kinds of conflicts, we can help on the legal end, but oftentimes it's the emotional factors that are going to be the most impactful. I can get a client a child support order. I can get a client a parenting order, but is that going to help them feel better? Sure, maybe a little bit, but it might not cover every aspect.
So, even on that, again, let's say, put on your counseling hat. Have you ever had a client come in and there just wasn't connecting? And so, be it, your personality or their personality, their ability to talk, like they just weren't comfortable with you as an individual. Um, what do you suggest to those people when they go to a counselor and they get that type of feeling?
That is normal human relationships. Um, Sometimes it takes time to warm up. Sometimes you might never warm up. Uh, it's it's building a new relationship. It's building a trust relationship, but it's also understanding what the role the therapist, what the role the counselor is going to have in your life. If you're going to somebody just to vent and you don't really want to learn, hey, honestly, if that is the thing that's therapeutic for you as a therapist, I just have to make sure you're in a safe environment and that what we are doing is therapeutic. You want to come and pay me, 150, 200 bucks an hour to just unload on me for an hour and you have no other desire? Maybe you don't have to have a really strong connection. You just have to have trust that you know that it's not going to leave that room. But if you're trying to make change, you have to have that stronger therapeutic relationship, that connection. And sometimes it will take a little while. Sometimes it might never show up. So I guess my recommendation is give it a shot, but also do your research. Go on a website like Psychology Today, for example. Take a look around, shop. There are usually dozens of therapists in sort of middle to large sized towns, and obviously hundreds in the bigger cities. But shop around a little bit. If you are feeling like the issues you're dealing with are due to trauma, specifically maybe it's domestic violence, find somebody who's got experience in dealing with domestic violence. If you are an elderly individual and you are separating from your spouse of like 40 years, find somebody who's got experience in working with seniors or elderly individuals, because maybe they are able to make a connection a little bit better. Therapists are usually pretty clear about who they work well with in their profiles and their biographies and in their websites. And so look for those clues, because your therapist is as likely to try to um, create a good relationship with you and give you the signs that this is working or this is not working, um, as much as you as the client are going to be doing that. Your therapist might even break up with you at some point in time, saying, you know what, I don't know if we're progressing as much as I'd like to. I'd like to give you a referral. If your therapist is saying, I want to give you a referral, take that to heart. It really isn't you, it is them in that scenario, and they just want the best for you.
Well, they're trying to help you.
Absolutely.
And they just don't feel that their style of therapy, and there's so many different theories behind therapy that different people follow, and trying to find a one that connects, that you can connect with, is important. So what I'm hearing from you is that it's sometimes that relationship doesn't work. Sometimes it takes a bit of time to make it work. And in either of those situations, it's okay.
Yeah.
And in either of those situations, it doesn't mean that you just quit and stop getting help.
Absolutely. And I know I keep kind of circling back to the cost piece a little bit, but one of the reasons I do that, especially when we're talking about therapy and like legal issues, is that very often the client is going to feel a large degree of trust in their lawyer, which is great. And they should. They should trust their lawyer. Uh, But that's not always the best person to be dropping everything onto. Give you an example. A lot of lawyers at that, 5 to 10 plus years of experience are charging anywhere from $350, $400, $500 an hour, maybe more. A therapist with the same amount of experience isn't coming close to that. They're maybe charging 200, 250 an hour tops. So where is the better place to go to vent your emotions, but also try to process and get techniques for trying to process those emotions a little bit better? Is it the person who's charging you more money, or the person who's got the qualifications to also teach you how to deal with those emotions? I'm gonna say it's probably the therapist in a lot of experiences. You're gonna save some money. Oftentimes, it's covered by your health benefits if you have those. And honestly, as much as your lawyer can sympathize with you as an individual, 95% of lawyers are not trained well for dealing with heavy emotions. They're doing it based off of their own experiences more than they're doing it based off their education.
So, in looking at counseling, then, and dealing with that cost, I mean, there's also other programs out there, and I think people, they shouldn't look at the cost as this is the end-all barrier, because I know there's always community services out there that offer discounted based off of people's income.
Yeah.
And so there's other solutions out there. When I look at one last question I want to kind of leave this with is, how do you feel when we look at family law and how the family law has evolved from a traditional family unit to include gay lesbian couples, transgendered couples? Do you feel that has any impact on counseling, or are people just people?
I mean, I think first off, people are just people, but people bring with them their experiences. So, I mean, if I'm helping out a transgender client, they have a different set of experiences than our, cisgender or, heterosexual client. But that doesn't mean that the experiences are, what's the best way of putting this? It doesn't mean that the experiences are going to be vastly different in terms of the depth of their emotion, because one client might have a very healthy upbringing that has prepared them for a lot of emotional moments in their life, and they might get through perfectly fine without a lot of external help. But another individual that we might say is this is a very successful individual might not have had those same skills taught to them, or the experiences to help shape those kinds of reactions. And so you might fall into a place where your straight cisgender heterosexual couples or individuals might have a much harder time than somebody from a more diverse population background, just based off of the experiences they've been through.
And I suppose, as you're talking, reminds me of a biracial friend that I had that had a different experience because they felt excluded from both traditional racial backgrounds growing up.
Yep.
So those kind of cultural and lived experiences as people go through, I imagine would also affect that as they separate and go through trauma again through that separation process.
Absolutely. The lived experience in terms of what folks have gone through is one of the biggest factors in how we cope. If you grew up in a emotionally healthy, really stable environment, people knew how to express their emotions and communicate really well, you're probably going to be okay in dealing with a relationship breakdown, for example. You might actually feel empowered already to go and seek out those the therapists that you're like, oh, I'm recognizing this is a problem for me and I need to go and get help. on the flip side, if you grew up in an environment that was high conflict, maybe where communication really wasn't good, or you had those parents where you you were in fear of ever opposing authority. Well, if you're going through a relationship breakdown, maybe you don't have the facilities to identify what's really happening or process the emotions.
And I've dealt with that a lot, and I've over the years I've had lots of clients where they grew up and they were told when they were from a very young age, men don't cry, or other kind of stereotypes like that. Being vulnerable is bad, right? And so the reason they don't approach therapy is they think that, again, as you mentioned before, it's a weakness
Yeah.
versus a support system to make themselves happier, stronger, more well-rounded, and be able to manage the trauma they're going through in relation to separation, the conflict, etc.
Yeah. I think therapy can be valuable for virtually anybody. I said this at the beginning. I think it can be valuable for just about anybody going through something, and it doesn't have to be a separation or divorce. It could be you are experiencing a change in jobs. Maybe you got terminated. Maybe you got terminated from your job. Maybe you got laid off. Maybe you're retiring and you just don't really know how to process those things. Having somebody that you can just go to and express, like, I am having these new feelings, maybe unwanted feelings, maybe they're just feelings that I haven't experienced before or haven't experienced recently, and how do I deal with them? That's part of the major purpose of therapy, being able to understand and process emotions and feelings so that we can go out into the world and contribute and enjoy life.
I'm listening. I was just like listening to your dialogue and you're telling yourself, I'm like, this always makes me think about something else, and it always makes me think about something else. I have questions, that always jumps out at me. But I know we're running out of time today, so again, I just want to thank you for coming on. Thank you for your insights on counseling and the family law process, and really appreciate your time.
Hey, not a problem at all. Thanks for having me. Hi, if you'd like to see more content like this, hit the subscribe button down below, give us a like, or leave a comment and tell us what you'd like to see in the future. Thanks for watching.